This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your hosts, Radio Joe Hughes and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
And welcome to IAQ Radio Plus. It's episode 689, and this week we welcome Scott Walden, the COO of Vetcor, for his perspective on the current state of the restoration industry. We're going to focus a lot on an article he wrote recently called The Squeeze. Before we get started, let's thank our sponsors. They are the reason we can do the show. Check out also afterthoughts.iaqradio.com. After the show, sponsored by First On Site. Our marquee sponsor is First On Site at firstonsite.com. Our association sponsors are the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, ACGIH.org, the American Industrial Hygiene Association, AIHA.org, the Institute for Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration Certification, IICRC.org. Industry sponsors are AEML Laboratories, AEMLINC.com, Particles Plus, ParticlesPlus.com, TSI Inc., TSI.com, Sunbelt Rentals, SunbeltRentals.com, Healthy Indoors Magazine, HealthyIndoors.com.
And now you can win a cool prize. It's time for the IAQ Radio Trivia question. Be the first to correctly answer. Simply email your answer to czlotnick@cs.com. Or if listening live, just text your answer from your computer. And now, here's the Z-Man.
Hello, everyone. Congratulations go out to John Lapotere, Florida IAQ Solutions in Winter Springs, Florida, who was first to identify the law of thermodynamics, which states that if two systems are in thermal equilibrium with a third system, then they are in thermal equilibrium with each other as the 0th law of thermodynamics. The IQ Radio Trivia question for today, February 3, 2023, has been sponsored by TSI Inc., an industry leader in precision instrumentation for monitoring of indoor air. Learn how to expand your IAQ investigations at TSI.com. Here's today's IAQ Radio Trivia question. Who is credited with the first use of the term Sergeant Major? Back to you, Joe.
All right. So today we've got Scott Walden. He's the Chief Operating Officer for Team Vetcor, LLC and Vetcor, LLC, a veteran-manned and managed insurance services franchise company specializing in emergency services for property damage. Scott served in the United States Army from October of 1983 until his retirement as a Sergeant Major in November 2006. Welcome, Scott. Great to talk to you.
Thanks so much, buddy. Glad to be here. Thanks for the invite.
And Colin, you're in from Tampa, Florida, the headquarters of Vetcor, correct?
That is correct. Yep.
And what kind of got you interested in the restoration world?
Well, I didn't even know the restoration world existed, quite honestly, many years ago. Our current president and CEO, Paul Huzar, and I served in the military over 37 or so years ago. And the airborne engineer portion of the military is a pretty small group, so we knew each other our entire careers. Paul retired here in the Tampa area, and he had the opportunity to apply for an engineering management position. He's a professional engineer. And in the process of doing that, he established a bromance with the gentleman who was offering the opportunity and said, I don't want you to be an engineer for me. I want you to be the president of this notional restoration company, Vetcor. And that's when it started, really, to escape from a long story. It was incorporated on Veterans Day 2013. And here we are today, originally just an individual restoration firm, and then expand to 3 offices. And now, as of 2019, we are a franchising company who awards, trains, and sells franchises.
And you've got franchises now in 9 places. Is that accurate?
Yeah, 8 different states. That is correct. Yeah, several here in Florida, and then 8 different states, mainly around the the southeast, but as far up into Kingston, New York, and our latest, which is going to open in Mobile, Alabama here very shortly.
Okay, interesting. I see you've got one that looks like Cincinnati. John has the map up on the up right now.
Yeah, that is Vetcor, the Miami Valley, covering just north of the Cincinnati area, but also into Cincinnati. He is one of our newest franchises. He is he's a Naval Academy graduate, then worked in the civilian sector for a long time, and he has joined the team as a franchise with a couple territories there.
Interesting. And is that Louisville I see?
That is Lexington, Kentucky.
Lexington. Okay.
Yeah, he is, interestingly enough, he is one of our only non-veteran franchisees, but certainly a veteran supporter. And he got interested because he was a former adjuster, and he was on a continuing education session that I performed, and he fell in love with that and the fact that I kind of nerded out on the science of it, and that started the bromance with him.
Interesting. Cliff, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Joe. Well, let's get into really the meat of the article. It caught my attention, and also caught Pete Consigli's attention. Actually, Pete saw it before I did and sent it to me. And so let's go kind of into the history of what they call insurance program work. Can you kind of tell the audience what that is and a little bit of the history of it?
Sure. Now, a lot of this is from my perspective, but I think that perspective has got some credibility in the fact that that we really built our original 3 offices on program work, because program work in the state of Florida is a much more reliable source than potentially in other states. Well, what I have learned is in the past, as insurance companies try to protect themselves from the bad actors, essentially the restoration industry is, even though it's 50 plus years old, it's still kind of in its infant stages. And there's a lot of folks out there who don't embrace education and the standard of care. So as insurance companies try to protect themselves from the bad actors, unscrupulous companies, well, then they started forming their own internal preferred vendor networks, and they would hire a vendor manager and some other staff, and so claims would come in, and this this stable of contractors of different trades that they had vetted and put some trust in would then service those claims as they came in and handed to them directly from the carriers. Good concept, got it. And when those concepts first started, those were good, solid business relationships, and it made sense. Well, even though I am not a fan of the third-party administrator, the TPA firms who have inserted themselves, I have to applaud the business model for sure. So here is a firm who says, hey, insurance carrier, I will find the contractors. I will vet those contractors. I will hold them to a performance standard. We will administrate your claims for you. You simply provide your guidelines, and we'll hold the contractors those guidelines. And oh, by the way, we'll do it for free, because we're going to take a cut from their invoice on the back end. And that, if you're a carrier and you think, okay, I don't need all this vendor management staff now, and I've got an organization who is staffed and has a function to manage our property claims for us, it was hard to say no for most of them. Even the ones who had good, solid relationships with their own contractors, it was tough for them to say no to that. Now, that has grown from an initial third-party administrator to now there are a whole host of different third-party administrators, each vying for the love of the carriers for at least some kind of portion of those claims. And that's how they earn money from the backs of the contractors doing the work.
Joe?
Well, I wonder, are there still companies that do it the old way?
Absolutely. I can't really answer so much, for all states, but if we look at Florida, the Florida market where I grew up operating here is a completely different animal from most other states. There's over 117 individual carriers in the state of Florida, and the market is so completely fractured because in the 2004-2006 timeframe, when all the big dogs said there's too much risk in the state of Florida, we are out of here. Well, that was left with a huge gap, and that was filled by independent mom and pop companies, smaller companies who grew to service Florida only. And so there are still several of those that we serve here in Florida that we have the one-on-one relationship, and those are by far the most valued. We kind of spoke off air briefly about our support of the recent hurricanes, and because there are still more claims that are going to come in that any one single contractor can service, well, then that gave us the opportunity to rack and stack these different sources by order of who we would want to serve the most. And sometimes it was just a financial decision: who's got the highest fee, who's got the lowest fee. On top of the list always go the carriers that we service outside of a third-party administrator. They are on the top of the list.
Interesting. And what are the pluses and minuses of working with these TPAs? I mean, there's got to be some pluses.
That's a good one, because I'm trying hard to figure that out as well. And when you're asking somebody who has been on both sides of it, somebody who's worked directly with carriers, and then somebody who has to work with carriers through a TPA, when I try to look at any potential pluses of a TPA from a contractor perspective, which is what you're asking, I'm going to be honest with you, Joe. There are none. There are none. If I can get claims directly from my relationships with carriers, that's the way I would prefer to do it. Now, I guess in today's market, if there was a benefit to TPAs, it's the fact that yes, because they've inserted themselves, I no longer have the ability, even during a storm, to go directly to many of the carriers because they are sheltered by the TPA. So that is the only way to get claims from them, is through those. So is that a benefit? Yeah, I mean, in a way, I would have to say yes.
Well, do all of your franchises do TPA work?
They do. For us, for a brand new franchise, one of the keys to their success is because of the relationships that we have built and the reputation that we have built. We are able to get a brand new franchise right out of the gate credentialed with many of the TPAs to start getting claims which they otherwise would not be able to credential with or get claims independently, because they wouldn't meet the minimum time and business or financial requirements. So as a kickstart for them, absolutely, we do turn them on to the opportunity to credential with several different TPAs to start getting work right away.
It sounds like one. Go ahead, Cliff.
No, back to the TPA thing. I think Joe asked you a question before, and I think you answered half of it. He asked you what were the pluses and what were the minuses of working with the TPA, and you said there are little, if any, pluses. What are the minuses?
Well, that's the easier question to answer for sure, Cliff. Number one is it's an added expense. They have inserted themselves, so there is a cost of doing business when you're working with TPAs. There is, in addition to the network referral fee, the fee that the TPA retains from your invoice, the amount of unnecessary claim administration that has to take place to scratch their itch is unbelievable. Not only on a daily claims basis, but compound that, by X number of claims that you get during a storm, and very few of those requirements are relaxed by the TPAs during CAT events. So, that no one is staffed for a major event. But when the requirements don't lax, then contractors are forced to take on significant additional expense in order to hire temp staff in just to administratively keep up with the demand of the TPAs. Now, that's a huge demand on a daily claims basis as well, but even more significant during a storm. And it's a minus because, if I'm servicing that same insured as a non-preferred vendor of a TPA, well, I don't have those administrative requirements. And technically, that carrier could care less when the insured was contacted, when the actual start date was, when the actual completion date was. They want to know that we serviced the client according to the standard of care and that we had a fair invoice. We don't have all that other administrative requirement. They don't need a 24-hour report from us. They don't need a photo report in exactly this format and a huge narrative. There's just all those additional requirements. Now, let me add on the additional costs. Not only the network referral fee do we have to pay to be part of the program, but you're going to have a pretty significant annual renewal fee with many of these. And sometimes it can be based on the volume, and sometimes it's a flat rate. So that's just your cost of being in the program itself. Now, as more and more TPAs emerge, and each are vying for more of the market share with the carriers, well, then each are trying to distinguish themselves as, the best and this, and we offer that. And right on the backs of these folks are these, software developers who are coming up with this, these supposed mitigation evaluation programs or programs that they are claiming, will add value to both the contractor and to the TPA and the carrier. And, in my opinion, it's just another cost, and they mandate those. And I'll call out Mika right now, 100%. Mika has managed, the folks at NextGear have managed to strategically insert themselves into this process. And because of that, Mika is mandated for numerous TPAs and numerous carriers. And Mika is a burden. It's expensive. If you consider it from a franchisor state, which is why I'd mentioned kind of off air on change management. Every time a TPA wants to insert a new or mandate a new software program, well, if I'm just an individual company, that's not a big deal. But if I've now got to take this new product and institute that across a franchise system, well, then that's a significant emotional event. And some are going to buck up against it, some aren't. But they're unnecessary. They are flat out unnecessary. And not only are they unnecessary, they're an additional expense for which we are unable to recoup any funds. Every single bit of that expense comes off the top of every single job. And it's an expense that a non-preferred vendor, somebody who went and also serviced Miss Johnson, they don't have to shoulder that expense. They don't have to use Mika. They don't have to use any of these other programs. They can use whatever they're using. And again, as long as they are servicing the insured for the standard of care and producing a fair invoice, they don't have any of that additional burden.
I've got a couple follow-ups. Do the third-party administrators get involved with your fire claims as well? And is it the same level of documentation and reporting and administration?
Yes, TPAs will get involved in almost every trade for which you are credentialed. The exception being a lot of them, and I'm not sure exactly why, Cliff, a lot of them don't insert themselves into the mold remediation process. They won't evaluate those estimates. That's when they allow you to go directly to the adjuster. And there are only a few TPAs who will actually issue you a mold remediation assignment. Many have steered away from that, but fire, contents, every single bit of that, yes.
Do you think that the policy limit that some insurance carriers have instituted for mold claims may be the reason. Some carriers in some states may have a $10,000 limit or a $30,000 limit or whatever. So that could be considered a small claim, I think, to maybe a TPA.
Well, potentially. And then I would tend to agree with you if that was the case across the board. But if I look at Alacrity, one of the larger TPAs, we will get mold remediation assignments directly from them for various carriers. But if I look at Contractor Connection, what used to be, and perhaps still is touted as the largest of the TPAs, they don't handle mold. So it's not standard across the board.
Scott, in the article, The Squeeze, you gave an example of a $2,000, which is, probably fairly common or maybe even a little low, but a $2,000 project. And you kind of broke down what the costs were to your company because of going through a TPA. I wonder if you could give our audience a little idea of, how much money are we talking about here?
Yeah. So in that, if I recall, in that example, I use one of the worst, not the worst case scenario by any means, because if I'm given the opportunity to call out the worst of the worst here on this show, I definitely will. But in this particular example, this was a State Farm claim through Alacrity, and from Alacrity, you're going to get hit with a 5.5% network referral fee and a $9.95 assignment fee right off the top of the invoice. State Farm, for some reason, feels that they wield enough power where they can demand for program vendors a 10% discount on all equipment charges on that job. Okay, now I gave an example that I think 70% of that $2,000 job was in equipment rental, and then provided the number. So if I take a peek at that, so you had in this case, a 6% network referral fee of $120 and $9.95 for an assignment fee. And then the 10% mandated discount on equipment, $140. So that means that $2,000 estimate, what's going to get put in your pocket is $1,730.05, which is a 13.5% burden right off the top. Now, if our franchisees are doing that same job, okay, well, then they've got this built-in 13.5% burden, and throw another 8% for royalties and marketing fee on that. And now you've got 21.5% burden on a job where the margins on water jobs just don't support that. And they make it, and I didn't even add some of the other ones. If this was
that's what I wanted to ask. You mentioned some other costs like buying the program, the computer program for the estimating, and those don't seem to be in that cost estimate or the costs.
I mean, you could certainly on an annual basis, you could amortize the cost of the program fee, the $2,500 or so it takes to be, you could take that across the number of jobs you had for a given period. This one could have also been a requirement of MECA, and there's going to be a per claim, MECA cost in this one, in addition to the subscription fees that you pay monthly to be part of MECA, and the additional monies that you have to pay for each additional carrier that you add into the MECA program. It just goes on and on and on. And so when we talk about that part of the squeeze, those are the administrative costs that you get hit with right up front. Now, you take the second part of that squeeze, and that is where these carrier partners are now going to institute estimating guidelines that are infinitely more restrictive than a restoration company outside of a program would have to adhere to. And I'll give you a perfect example of that one. And you would think, as a veteran-owned organization, we would love USAA to no end. And I love the concept of USAA. I love helping USAA customers. But USAA, well, first of all, if I kind of frame this out real quick, in the estimating program, For nearly every line item that you can select, there is a during hours line item and an after hours line item. And those after hours line items are typically around 30% increase from during hours. And there's a good reason for that. USAA, no matter when you service that claim, does not allow any after hours line items. Now, come on. You know, it's the same with
what about holidays? Do you get anything extra for holiday work?
For all carriers that allow after hours charges, yes. So anything after 5 p.m., holidays, weekends, all of those are considered after hours. But if you perform a USA mitigation job as a preferred vendor on a Saturday, then you get a single after hours charge, and that is the emergency service call. Every other line item you use, you are not allowed to use after hours line items. And so when I talk about that squeeze, I'm like, come on, these are the very entities that you put your arms around and credentialed and said you wanted to satisfy, you know, the insured's needs, and you wanted us to save you money on claims, but yet you continue to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze those folks who are already saving you money from not producing inflated, outrageous, unscrupulous invoices.
You know, Scott, we've talked about this topic, I'll bet 20 times on this show. This is the first time it's kind of really sunk into me I'm not a restoration guy. I'm from the indoor air quality world. By going through those numbers now, it's finally starting to sink in. I'm starting to understand a little better why there are so many complaints about this whole system. Cliff, go ahead. Let me let you go.
So let me ask you a question, Scott. What role does standards play in this?
Standards govern the actions every restoration company should perform on every job. The interesting thing is, and I'm glad you bring this one up, Cliff, because every time I teach an IICRC course, I talk about this specifically. I hear all the time from people, oh, I will never do program work or work directly for carriers because they tell you what you can and can't do on a job site. And I will tell you what, I am the first one to raise as high as I can the BS flag on that. Because if you look at this thing systematically, insurance carriers are in the business of mitigating risk. TPAs are not going to inherently accept risk. So if you so narrowly think that insurance carriers or TPAs are going to tell you what you can and can't do on a job site, well, then you're misguided. Because they're not going to accept that responsibility by telling you what you can and can't do. Your responsibility is to perform for the standard of care. What a TPA or a carrier will do is tell you what they will and will not pay for. They won't tell you what you can and can't do. That's your responsibility to perform to the industry standard of care for the trade that you're performing, and nothing can make you do otherwise.
Okay, so let's go back. Okay, but doesn't the industry standard of care tell you how much equipment you can use, what type of equipment you can use, where you should put it, and I mean, correct or incorrect?
Partially correct, partially incorrect.
Okay, what's incorrect?
So it will provide the general guidelines for the calculation of equipment to use initially. And in most cases, it is an absolute best guess, best educated guess, but it is not the bottom line. So it will tell you, it will take you through the calculation of how much dehumidification to use initially, how many air movers to place, but it's within very narrow guidelines. It does its absolute best. And the programs provided out there are built off of that.
Okay, I understood. So let's just take the same job.
Okay.
And we have 6 different water damage restoration companies that look at that job. Okay. Would you agree that if you're doing this according to industry standards, that the estimates are pretty much going to be in line with one another, because they use the same calculations for sizing equipment, they use the same calculation for determining the number of air changes and air movers and so on and so forth? Okay, so what that does is that creates parity. In my opinion, that creates parity in the marketplace. and takes you from being a knowledgeable restoration professional to being a delivery man for rental equipment. Because they take much of the other stuff out of it. You know, in the old days, what happened was it was really up to the contractor what type of equipment he bought. So if you invested in bigger, more powerful dehumidifiers, you could dry the job faster than someone who was using standard equipment. Did you understand what I mean? And the standard has taken all of that, in my opinion, from what I've seen, the standard has very much taken a lot of that choice away from the contractor. In the old days, the contractor called the shots. And I believe the contractors still call the shots in fire restoration. I don't believe they call the shots in water damage. I think the standard calls the shots.
Yeah, well, I've been chomping at the bit to jump on this one. And when we look at this, first of all, that job that you see right there in the example, the one we talked about, that same job, I would have to first say that I absolutely do not agree that the invoices would be in line, because it depends. Is the person doing that a program vendor? Well, then they're going to be estimating that job per carrier estimating guidelines. It is typically going to be more restrictive. If I'm not a program vendor and I have the ability to add additional line items, or if I'm not restricted on how many days I'm allowed to include in the estimate for the amount of monitoring, or if I'm not restricted by X, Y, or Z, or if I'm one of those, I'll give you an example. That the job we just looked at to do a peer review on, the company who performed it was about 80 miles away, and on their estimate was a $1,000 deployment fee. So no, the estimates are not going to be the same across the board. Now let me jump on the next part, where back in the old days, the contractors got to call the shots. Listen, technology back then and the science of structural drying early on in this industry were garbage. People did not understand structural drying. We did not have the technology we have today in order to adequately find out what was wet, how wet it was, and once it was dry. And we didn't understand the science of drying. We didn't understand vapor pressure differentials and vapor pressure in general. And so folks were shooting from the hip. And yes, did they think that if they stuck 3 or 4 more dehumidifiers in that job because they were calling the shots, the job was going to dry faster? Well, technology and studies have shown these days that is systematically incorrect. More dehus inside a job are not going to make materials evaporate faster, because dehumidifiers, in addition to providing some temperature to the room, their job is to collect the evaporated moisture that other methods to get the stuff dry are supposed to take place. So the standard itself, now more based on, and keep in mind, this is coming from a contractor who owns a for-profit business. The standard itself is based on now more of the science of applied structural drying. It says, based on some mathematical computation, that you should need this much dehumidification initially. Okay, so yes, I guess technically, is that no longer the contractor calling the shot? That has given the contractor some parameters on how much is needed initially. And then the contractor has to be smart enough throughout the evaluation process to see if that best guess was good or if they need to add additional. The biggest part of a contractor's argument with the standard these days is with the newest versions that came out that provide a calculation for the amount of air movers to use. Now, the standard will never tell you where to put them or what type of air mover to use. The standard could care less. The standard doesn't even tell you what type of dehumidifier to use. It simply tells you the amount of dehumidification required. So, but contractors bucked up the most on the formula for calculating the number of air movers. And it's not perfect by any means, but in the history of histories, has an adjuster ever pushed back on the number of air movers you had on a job? Everybody wants to tackle, and estimate reviewers want to home in on the amount of dehumidification that you're using and try to cut that down. And those who don't understand the standard, those who don't understand the science of drying, are unable to properly defend themselves. And they're simply then just sitting back complaining about a young estimate reviewer incapable of going outside their left and right limits, putting restrictions on them. Those contractors who understand the science of drying and understand the standard itself are more efficient and more profitable than those who don't traditionally.
Hey, let's go to halftime, John. When we come back, I'm sure, Cliff, you're going to be first up. Our marquee sponsor is First On Site, your trusted full-service disaster recovery and property restoration company at firstonsite.com. Association sponsors are ACGIH, Advancing Careers of Professionals in Environmental Health, Industrial Hygiene, and Safety, interested in defining their science. ACGIH.org. AIHA, Healthy Workplaces, a Healthier World. AIHA.org. The IICRC, a nonprofit standards development and certifying body for the cleaning and restoration industry. IICRC.org. Industry sponsors are AEML Laboratories. Free shipping, great pricing, same-day results with no rush fee, AEMLinc.com. Particles Plus, feature-rich particle counters and air quality instrumentation. Count on us, particlesplus.com. TSI Inc., an industry leader in precision instrumentation for monitoring indoor air. Learn how to expand your IAQ investigations, TSI.com. Sunbelt Rentals. Availability, reliability, and ease for all your IAQ and restoration needs at sunbeltrentals.com. And Healthy Indoors Magazine, a free online magazine for industry professionals and consumers, healthyindoors.com. All right, let's jump back into it with Scott Walden. Cliff, you're up.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, Scott, where to begin? Okay, I was in your neck of the woods, I guess last week, and if I'm not mistaken, that's what they call Climate Zone 1. Okay, and if I'm not mistaken, I think there's something like 7 climates. Is that right, Joe? 7 climate zones?
Yeah, 9, somewhere around 9. There.
Okay, all right. So we take the IICRC standard and we put it into 7 or 9 different climate zones. You know, what effect does climate have on that?
Okay, well, let's try to unpack this one, because that's an interesting question. When we're talking about water damage mitigation, then I'm gonna keep it to the interior of the home for right now, because that's where the vast majority of these happen. Now, when I'm talking about the interior of the home, I have the responsibility to control the climate, the atmospheric conditions inside the home. So when I'm inside, at least initially, then climate zone doesn't have an effect on me. What does have an effect on me climate zone wise is when I start having to remove the materials and start affecting the building envelope. Then I've got a whole bunch more to contend with. That is, you know, I don't have that concern here in Florida, but when especially during this latest freeze, when we manage some of our franchisees that are going through that, then, you know, the big swings in climate there can have a huge effect on what's taking place inside the building. I'm not sure if that's what you were alluding to there, Cliff, or if I answered the question.
Well, no, I think that, you know, in climate zone 1, not only is the climate different, the construction is different, the materials are different. Not many homes in Tampa probably have basements and so on and so forth. Yeah. So there's a whole lot of differences. So it's tough when you try to put one formulation for everything. So that's really my point. And I think I don't necessarily blame insurance companies. I think they wanted some idea of controlling costs. But the calculations that you speak of were not field calculations. The calculations that you speak of, for the most part, come from controlled environments inside of buildings in which someone constructed a drying house or a wet house or whatever. You know, many of these homes are inside of a warehouse or whatever. So that it's not really a real life scenario. Because what happens is when we take these statistics, or when insurance companies take these statistics and put them on a commercial project, those calculations go out the windows. On these commercial losses, they never have enough equipment, they never have enough air changes, and so on and so forth. So,
yeah, it's a good point you're making, that in general, the standard, there's not a separate standard for residential versus commercial, certainly, and I do completely agree with you on that one. What I would say is the interesting part about this is our ability these days, compared to when the standards were even first being initially developed, is our ability to evaluate evaporation potential or vapor pressure differentials, which throttles 100% the evaporation effort, the drying effort in general. And the industry's understanding of how things dry has advanced so much that you can take those same principles and then even those contractors who are shooting from the hip, or maybe it's not even fair to say shooting from the hip, using their own original judgment on how much dehumidification to have and how many air movers to put, they should still be using the same principles of vapor pressure and vapor pressure differentials to check their performance and to know if those initial calculations they used, whatever scenario, whether it is commercial using deskants or whether it's a big residential or whether they formed a drying chamber in a crawl space or a basement, in the end, their ability to measure their performance today is greater than it ever has been. The issue we have industry-wide is that folks have not embraced getting training and understanding the science of that part of applied structural drying. And so, if you go into a water damage project and on day one, your target material is at 60% moisture content, and you come back a day later and it's at 48. Well, for years, we've just said, okay, good. I made progress. Everything's cool. My grains per pound have gone down. My dew point's gone down. All my measurements have gone down and moisture content's gone down. I'm tracking. But we never had the ability to know was that good enough? Did I set this drying environment up the absolute best that I can? And we didn't have any way to tell. We didn't have great instruments back then, and we didn't have institutional knowledge of what right really looked like. And today we have that. So regardless of the standard, regardless of what the calculations in the standard put out, vapor pressure and vapor pressure differentials are king. And understanding those are your justification, whether you're a preferred vendor, whether you are just a regular contractor outside of program work performing, those tell you whether or not you have that environment set up perfectly.
I think that, as far as the industry learning about drying, I agree that the industry learned about drying, but the information that they learned has been out there for many, many years. They just didn't know where to get it. They didn't know who had it. And they okay. So let's talk just for a minute about the drying chamber. You mentioned it. That's really one of my pet peeves, actually. People are taught to set up this drying chamber. So what they do is they go into this room and they kind of make the room airtight, and they put their equipment in there, and there are a number of different reasons why they do it. And so, we don't want contamination to get out, or, we don't want to lose the humidification. And in my opinion, the reason that they do this is they want to see more water in the bucket rather than anything else. Because when you create a drying chamber, you have another choice. Another choice is, in most of these water losses, the rest of the building or the rest of the home is drier than the area that was actually affected. And that's a key source when you're talking about vapor pressure, or it's a tremendous source. And if you take the room that you're in and you put it under a slight negative pressure, maybe 300 or 400 CFM, and you leave the door open to the rest of the house, in my opinion, and in my studies that I've done and conducted, I can dry it faster than someone who doesn't do that, because there's a lot of additional energy that you can take care of, and dry air and lower grains in other parts of the home. But they're just, I think the answer on many of these situations is it depends. And what happens is, when you have a written standard, it doesn't take all these things into consideration. It can't. And, you have these general guidelines and so on and so forth. So that's really, that's my beef with it. And
in many ways, I don't disagree at all, Cliff. I'll be the first one to admit, and I teach my students, that the standard isn't perfect. It gets better all the time, and it's certainly better than it was a long time ago. Unfortunately, there are a lot of folks out there, because we have a standard, there's a lot of folks who use that standard to their advantage. And just because the ANSI IICRC S500 discusses drying chambers, well, now you can have 2 bedrooms with a Jack and Jill bathroom between them, and you will have some contractors that will put a DHU in one bedroom, a DHU in the other bedroom, and a DHU in the bathroom, and close all the doors and say he's got 3 drying chambers. As opposed to someone who would do it intelligently and say, okay, with this size dehumidifier, I could easily get, the same effect by just creating one large drying chamber. So some take it to the extreme. I got it. I get it. Unless we're talking about, and here, everything we're talking about here is a category 1 loss, uncontaminated loss, where you can have a lot of flexibility with either establishing or not establishing drying chambers. Where the standard really puts its foot down is whenever we're talking about contaminated losses, and then the engineering controls that have to be in there to separate affected from unaffected areas. And I think we would both understand why that happens. But yes, for a category 1 loss, uncontaminated, I mean, you're really wide open to make those kind of decisions, whether you want to isolate that or not isolate that. But I agree with what you said about using the rest of the home and kind of the thirsty air in the unaffected area. It makes sense.
Let me go ahead, Cliff, and then we'll go to roundup. You can do one more, then we'll go to the roundup.
Okay. One thing, and I'm just gonna suggest it. Do you guys have your own training facility?
We do, yes.
Where you do it? Can you describe it to me? What's the building like?
You mean like an IICRC flood house?
Yeah, something like that.
No, we don't. We have a training academy here, but we do not yet have a flood house. The one that we've used in the past is the one they have up there at the Reed's Drying Academy up in Sharpsburg, Georgia. And that particular facility, you might be familiar with that facility. It's a pretty atypical IICRC approved flood house, which for teaching ASD. So it's going to be elevated. It's got a crawl space, a comfortable crawl space. It's going to have various types of floor coverings and wall coverings and different cabinetry and hardwood flooring and all the things that are required to be taught during ASD. So that's that.
I guess I just have one question. When you're there, did they float carpet at all?
They did, yes.
Okay.
They taught floating carpet, yes.
Okay. Did you ever see what happens when you introduce smoke when you're floating carpet?
I haven't seen that. I'd be interested. What? What do you see?
No, you need to do that. You need to buy a little smoke machine. You need to try that because it'll kind of change your mind, I think. And I think that's one of the things that happens in water damage training. You know, we talk all about air movement, and you can't see where the air goes unless you have smoke. When you have smoke, you can see where the air goes.
Mhm.
You can see where the air doesn't go. And it really opens. I'm going to send you some photos a little bit later. You know,
Yeah, I'd love to see that. I'm not a huge fan of floating carpet myself personally, but it is still taught today in ASD.
Yeah. That's where we're different. I'm a big fan floating guy for sure. Okay.
Yeah,
Joe?
I could tell you, I'm mainly not a big fan of it because almost all of our carpet is over concrete here.
Okay. Oh yeah. Well, Well,
As a little different animal.
Yes, it is. John, let's go to the roundup, buddy. I really want to thank Madison IAQ, good group of folks there, and then we'll be talking to them again here real soon. But Scott, I guess my question for the roundup is, what about the restoration industry has surprised you? You know, coming from a military background, was there anything that kind of just took you back and you went, wow, I never expected that from this type of business?
Well, quite honestly, what surprised me the most is when we started operating our third office down in South Florida. And what surprised me was the level of and the amount of just cowboy, unscrupulous contractors down there operating totally outside of any kind of standard, any kind of guidelines. And that really took me back. I thought, all right, these are supposed to be legitimate businesses. And I don't experience that in 23 years in the military, and I didn't experience that in my first post-military employment. So it was my first exposure to folks who were just unscrupulous and just bad business people.
Interesting. Cliff?
No, I just, I respect you. I respect what you're doing. I've just been around a long time, and, I get a little crotchety sometimes. So.
That's good.
Don't take it personal. I'm here to help you.
I enjoy just going off of the beaten path a little bit, because that's great, man. I don't know it all by any means. So, it's interesting, as well as I do, Cliff, the standard was written by a bunch of old dudes that have been around for a while. And this industry needs some young, bright, motivated minds to go in and really take a hard look at this thing, because it's the same old dudes who keep making minor tweaks from this version to this version to this version, some based on science, some based on old crotchety folks getting their input into it. But I think it needs a fresh look.
I'll tell you, you probably, if you Google search us, look for a guy named Lloyd Weaver and IAQ Radio. You'll probably get a kick out of that show.
Yeah, that was a good one. Hey, let me ask one more thing before we wrap this up. There's a 2021 Restoration Industry Benchmark Survey, and I'm wondering if you could tell us some of the key points that came out of that survey.
Yeah, the latest survey that came out was
for 2022, I guess.
Yeah, was not surprising at all. And I feel it's because of a lot of the points that I made in the squeeze. Not that what I don't want to get that. I want to make sure I'm clear. Not that what I wrote has any effect on the industry, but I think those things I wrote about are why the number of contractors, or the percentage of contractors that are participating in TPA programs has remained about the same, but the amount of work that is being performed for TPAs has significantly decreased. Most folks right now that I speak to would be very, very comfortable with about a we'll say a 25% program work and 75% non-program work. Some kind of healthy mix. Some would even like less than that. And that's a pretty big difference from years past. And why are more and more folks doing less program work? Well, because it's harder and harder and harder to make a profit doing it.
I wonder, Scott, do you guys do much work that's not insurance work? You don't get any payment from the insurance. Do you worry that such a large percentage of your work is insurance based?
Oh, no doubt. No doubt. And any company who has too many of their eggs in one basket should be, especially when it comes to the insurance market, which is hugely erratic. They could come, legislation could happen next week that says, insurance companies are no longer to have preferred vendors. You don't know when something like that could ever happen. So anybody who puts too many of their eggs in one basket is at risk. And so, yes, we do, certainly, based on our military background. We do a huge amount of work out on MacDill Air Force Base, and other franchisees do a huge amount of work on some of the military bases close to them. That's a bit unique to us because of our ability to have those connections. But folks need to have a good balance of where those sources of income are coming from, between residential, commercial, program work, non-program work, non-insurance related work. For those who are going to be, and I would imagine you'll see your most successful organizations are ones that have a really good balance.
Hey, Joe, if I might, I heard something very, very interesting I guess it must have been last Thursday, actually. It happened to have been your neck of the woods, Scott, down there. And I attended a 3-day event that dealt with building science and also dealt with hurricane response and so on and so forth. And one of the speakers is a guy named Peter Crosa. Peter Crosa is a very well-respected independent adjuster. He is past president of the Independent Adjusters Association and so on and so forth. And he happens to attend events kind of on both sides of the fence. He goes to insurance company events, goes to industry events. And the one thing that he's found out is insurance companies don't like and don't trust restoration contractors. He's also kind of found out that restoration contractors don't trust insurance companies. And one of the interesting things he talked about is what insurance companies are now doing in order to deny hail claims. And he kind of went through situations where previously roofs would be replaced without any question. Now the insurance companies are hiring engineering companies and so on and so forth to make inspections and report that what's wrong with these roofs after hail is just normal wear and tear and so on and so forth. So again, I think that contractors want to make a dollar and hold on to it, and also so do insurance carriers. And I think they're probably better at it than we are. But no,
you're absolutely right, and that you made some good points. And interesting, and what gave me a different perspective on the insurance industry from starting and working this in Florida so much, which is a unique animal for sure. Some fun facts here, and I might not have the percentages exactly, but it will paint a clear picture of why Florida is a case study for all kinds of things going wrong in the insurance market. The state of Florida has over 10% of the entire property insurance premium in the U.S. Now, we certainly don't have 10% of the population, but we've got 10% of the premium. What the state of Florida also has is over 70% of all property damage related litigation in the U.S.
Right.
Okay, so when we talk about the insurance market and insurance companies trying to shelter themselves from the bad actors, when I talk about the bad actors, they're also the ones who take advantage of current litigation and are super litigious because it's so easy to be in the state of Florida. And, contractors in general in the state of Florida, whether they are good or bad, have played a big part in the upset of the insurance market in the state of Florida. Insurance companies have as well by by just trying to battle horrific litigation, which has, by the way, recently been some decent, well-served litigation that was passed that I think is going to help quite a bit. But it did give me a better perspective as to why insurance companies, and let me just caveat this by saying that our original partner, the guy I talked about early on, who offered Paul Huzar the opportunity to be the president of Vetcor, is the same guy who founded Florida Peninsula Edison Insurance in Florida and then sold it off, and is the current owner of Verd Insurance in Florida. So we have the unique perspective from both sides, getting this guy in our ear and saying, hey man, here are the issues, and he sees both sides because he's invested in both sides. So I've got a real good idea of, why things occur, at least a better perspective of the insurance market. And some of the things you say, Cliff, are absolutely true. They are things that used to be covered on a regular basis with no question. Now, just in order to survive, if you look at the number of companies in Florida that have gone insolvent, insurance companies have gone insolvent recently, it's scary. It is definitely scary. And so are each of them trying to find ways to insert policy language that is more restrictive to protect themselves so they can survive? 100%. It's a business, just like we're in business. And each of them are trying to hold on to the dollar. And I agree, Cliff, they're a hell of a lot better at doing it than we are. That's for sure. Because TPAs are digging into our pockets, not theirs. We've got a battle with that. Yeah.
Hey, I think another thing I would mention is that I believe that, and I understand that Florida is looked at kind of as the first in the nation, so other states may follow suit, and other insurance carriers that maybe aren't in Florida are probably looking pretty closely at what goes on there, which leads me to this question, Scott. Florida recently passed some changes to the insurance laws, I guess, that I think that were designed to help the insurance carriers, I believe, because there were a lot of claims coming up and assignment of benefits and so on and so forth. I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on those changes?
The biggest change and the hardest one to get through, if you look at the legislature in the state of Florida, it's made up of lawyers, as in many states. And one of the worst pieces of legislation we had was called the one-way attorney fee. And in the one-way attorney fee, first of all, we had the whole assignment of benefits deal, and previous legislation kind of put the kibosh on that a little bit. This legislation essentially outlawed it. But when we had the assignment of benefits, then essentially a contractor could put themselves in the shoes of the insured and really drive the train on the claim, to include the ability to litigate. Well, because of the one-way attorney fees, if that contractor was awarded even a small portion of their original invoice, well, then the losing party, which was going to be the insurance company, had to pay all attorney's fees. So if you're an unscrupulous contractor, or even if you're a sound contractor who was going to debate a rather large invoice with an insurance carrier, well, then sue them. Because certainly there's no jury out there who's not going to award you at least a portion of the invoice for the work you performed. And you're totally incentivized to do so because you don't have to pay your own attorney. And that caused over 70+% litigation in the state of Florida for property damage claims. And most of that was initiated by the contractors. And of course, throw in public adjusters, and they're rampant in Florida, but all of those would get in cahoots. Public adjusters who had contractors under their belt, and then it's just game on after that.
Interesting. Cliff, final thoughts, final questions.
I guess one other thing. I think this new legislation, according to, if I'm not mistaken, according to CROSA, also isn't that great for policyholders. It takes a few things away from policyholders that they previously had. I off the top of my head, I don't remember exactly what they are, but you're right, Scott. It did strip back a lot of these things that were used to abuse insurance companies, but policyholders also suffer as well with that.
Yeah.
And what with one of the other things that, if I'm not mistaken, Crosa said, were a lot of these insurance companies that were just in Florida went into business to kind of fill the marketplace after the larger companies pulled out. And a lot of these companies were not well capitalized, and they also kind of took advantage, creating policies that may not have been as liberal coverage wise and so on and so forth as the carriers, who pulled out. So, and I guess the worst thing, and I'm not, this is just speculation, but some of these businesses may have gone into business realizing the advantages of business failure. So essentially, if you collect the premium and then you don't pay the claim and then you go out of business, you unfortunately take some people's money with you. And that may have happened as well with some of the smaller carriers that went out of business. But
I'll tell you, as a Florida policyholder, I watched pretty carefully that legislation to see what effect it was going to have on me and my particular property. And what I've seen is there's not going to be a perfect solution. It was a pretty good balance between slightly more restrictive policies for the insured, definitely stricter operating guidelines for AOB and the contractors, and getting rid of the one-way attorney's fees. And whatever, the biggest benefit to insured is going to be inherently, it's going to take some time for it to take effect, is lower premiums. Premiums, because of the litigation in Florida, are outrageous. And so the emergency session was really based on putting measures in place to try to curb the amount of these, or the cost of these policies, because you were forcing folks out of their homes who could no longer afford to insure their properties, and that was causing a pretty big deal. So yeah, I think it was a pretty good balance this time. Most people, although some of the insurance experts were pretty good friends with the former president and CEO Barry Gilway of Citizens, which was never supposed to be, but is the largest insurer in the state of Florida. It is the state-run insurance provider that was only born from the fact when all the big dogs pulled out. What happens when the private sector fails? Well, the public folks have to pick up the strings, and that's where Citizens was formed. Citizens was formed, essentially under the model to go out of business eventually when others would take over those policies. And now it is, again, with the most recent storms, it is by far the largest carrier in the state of Florida.
Wow.
That's not healthy either.
They were supposed to be the carrier of last resort.
Yeah, the funny part, they're carrier of last resort. And now, today, they are the largest carrier and with the lowest premiums.
Interesting. Scott, final thoughts? Anything we missed you'd like to add? Any final thoughts?
No, I tell you what, I'm super appreciative that you guys had me on. I get pretty passionate about this subject, as does Cliff. I think everybody in the end, I don't think there's anybody who is against a standard, but a standard that at least gets folks operating within the same left and right limits, but also gives contractors the ability and the flexibility to make what they think are smart decisions given the situations of each project. And what irritates me, I guess, the most is the standard gives you some pretty wide left and right limits in most areas. It is the is the TPAs who have taken it to the extreme. And, you go to a TPA or you go to even the MICA program, and I'll end with a quick example because I'm pretty passionate about this as well. The IICRC S500 will give you a formula to calculate approximately the number of air movers you need for a given project. And it doesn't do a horrific job on calculating for wet floors, walls, and ceilings. And it will have X number. But what a program like that is completely incapable of is assessing the entire geometry of there. Is there a kitchen island? Are there cabinets where I've got to line up air movers to get airflow there? All those other specialty situations that you have to spend resources fighting with a young estimate reviewer who has a checklist or who sees a set number in MICA, and that's the bottom line, and man, that is the older I get, the less crotchety I get. Maybe I need to turn the other way around. But nothing upsets me more than when I have to see my young educated estimators having to fight that fight with folks because they just don't understand. So, we've got a standard out there that gives us some parameters, but like everything else, and all associated with the AOB, assignment of benefits was a great idea initially. You take your car, it's got damage to it, to the auto shop, you're signing an assignment of benefits. That insurance carrier is going to pay them directly. It was used the way it was meant to be used. It's not until folks take something and take it to the extreme and twist it that it becomes something it wasn't supposed to be. And that's what some folks have done with the standard. But your perspective, Cliff, was fantastic. I love that. And you've been a great host, Joe. I appreciate you guys having me on. And, give me a call anytime you want to. First of all, Cliff, anytime you want to battle on any of this stuff, man, let's throw it down, because I love your perspective. You've been doing this a lot longer than I have, and I can learn something every day. So I appreciate you guys.
One thing, after the show, we have what's called afterthoughts. We'll send you a link, and the discussion can continue there. Some people may want to make some comments. There was one comment, Joe, from Lauren McIntyre. He said that the other issue such of media blames contractors for these insurance companies going bankrupt, and he finds that to be a little bit annoying. So there's some good contractors, some bad ones, and it's tough doing business down there. While I was down there, I had a friend, a close business associate, call as a condo, and he needed people to respond to it. It was tough getting contractors because a lot of these people are still busy. And, you have to go through this mold assessment situation. There was mold in there. It takes a couple of days to find out what kind of mold it is, and so on and so forth. And, if that job was in Pennsylvania, we'd be done by now. But, it's still under containment. There's waiting. Wow. So it's just.
Yeah, that was one of the very first articles that I wrote for CNR magazine, was as a licensed mold assessor. The insurance companies can't believe that for the most part, I indicate an initial assessment with protocol is garbage. And I understand why they do it in Florida to protect themselves. But if I'm a preferred vendor of yours and I'm a licensed mold remediator, let me have at it, man. And quite often I could care less what kind of mold it is.
Absolutely. I think most, but I don't know that we.
I got to get rid of it.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm with you on that one. But I got some heat from my buddies at Normie.
That's all right. Yeah.
That's okay. I can take it.
Hey, they have their way of making money. You got to be out in the real world.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this is Radio Joe saying thanks to this week's host, Scott Walden of Vetcor. Thank you, Scott. Great to see you. Great to meet you. Great to talk to you. My co-host, the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. John, you got to have faith at the controls. Most importantly, our great sponsors and loyal audience. We'll be back next Friday at noon with the next episode of IAQ Radio Plus.
For IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Reel saying thanks for listening.